Marvellous. Hello online if you can hear me. Fantastic. Right. Have you come across Rawls, Michelle, having been based in North America?
No, actually, I haven't done a lot of reading on Rawls. So yeah, it was. I got through some of it, not all of it. So it was interesting.
Yeah.
Because I've very little. So.
Well, we'll get started shortly.
Also very new to me, but I've been in North America.
Yes, yeah.
But generally, I haven't pretty much Rawls, or much legal philosophy. But I had a flatmate in Netherhall who, well, he wasn't very big into Rawls, but he was reading a lot of them.
Right.
His master's, which involved, for him, writing a critique of Rawls based on the works of John Gray and Michael Sandel. Somewhat one of these things, and I think it was John Gray accused John Rawls of doing ontological violence to the human person. And I thought it was quite the criticism.
Well, it's always, yeah. Sorry, Michelle.
No, it was just I hadn't come across that. So what was that? What happened?
I think so. One of the things we'll explore tonight, I think, is how Rawls wanting to put what he calls the reasonable expectations.
Yes, yeah, sort of. Yeah, essentially that.
Yeah, the sort of expectations about justice. The four questions of what he calls moral desert, or your board based on the kind of person you are, let's say, in terms of merit, in terms of social status, in terms of inheritance. All those things are secondary for all, but what that looks like ontologically speaking is a completely featureless subject. And I think that's what that criticism is driving at, but also just the general point. More stringent it must be on it, or what it determines to be the edges. And I think a lot of people feel that paradoxically to be a kind of suffocation of freedom of thought, because the edges of what's questionable become increasingly well defined from a liberal perspective.
Yeah.
And people want to challenge those because they're the most well defined things in that space.
Yeah.
People move to the extremes in the tolerant liberal society on kind of boredom, maybe. Partly. And so that was another way to do ontological violence.
Stranger attracts me.
Yes, yeah. Well,
they're exciting.
I think as it's 6:05, I'm just going to make a start.
Great.
And we'll see what happens. Do you want one of you want to take my card, please? And then obviously if we do get shunted out downstairs, we can quickly move downstairs. But welcome to our Liberty series, Michelle and Lorraine, on Rawls and Sandel, the final episode in this mammoth saga that Jeff and I have composed, taking place in person and online. We're looking at two figures, John Rawls, penning in the 1970s, and Sandel, a contemporary, what would you say, sort of academic and literary critic, sort of, within the current sphere. So we're going to delve into both of those. I'm going to present the first half, and we're going to delve into the content of Rawls, and then we're going to look at some critiques going forward after Jack's done a small little bio of Sandel. So the introduction to John Rawls. John Rawls stands as one of the most influential political thinkers of the 20th century. He shaped modern political liberal thought with a theory of justice in 1971. His vision of justice as fairness grounded in the principles of equality and individual liberty sought to reconcile the tensions between freedom and social cooperation. Rawls uses the term the original position and a veil of ignorance that provide a powerful framework for justifying a redistributive liberal democracy. His ideas sparked intense debate, most notably with Robert Nozick, whose Anarchy, State and Utopia in 1974 mounted a libertarian critique. Nozick rejected Rawls' emphasis on distributive justice, arguing instead for a minimal state that respected individuals' natural property rights. The rivalry defined a key fault line in contemporary political philosophy between egalitarian liberalism and libertarianism, shaping debates on justice, rights, and the role of the state that persist today. So before I delve into the text that we're actually going to focus on today, I thought we'd just go through a couple of supplementary texts. They're actually later than A Theory of Justice, but because I've just kind of outlined the main kind of arguments of A Theory of Justice, I thought I'd go through these first. So in 1985, John Rawls' essay, Justice is Fairness, Political Not Metaphysical, marks a key shift in his thought, clarifying his theory as a form of political liberalism rather than a comprehensive moral doctrine. Responding to critiques of A Theory of Justice, Rawls emphasises that justice as fairness is not grounded in any specific metaphysical or religious worldview, but is instead a freestanding political conception that can be endorsed by citizens with diverse moral and philosophical commitments. And that's one of the criticisms that I think Jack and I will certainly be raising about how do you grapple this question of diversity across the globe and without kind of homogenising the individual agent, as we were just sort of talking about. This move reflects Rawls' growing concern with stability in pluralistic societies, laying the groundwork for his later work, Political Liberalism, in 1993. By focusing on the idea that overlapping consensus, he argues that different moral traditions can converge on liberal democratic principles without requiring deeper argument on ultimate truths. Though Rawls does not directly engage with Robert Nozick in this essay, his reaffirmation of distributive justice and fairness implicitly counters the libertarian critiques. And when we say libertarian, we are talking about the classical liberals that we were looking at prior to Mill. Libertarianism is just the kind of modern term, really. I know we could go into more semantic detail about this, but realistically, libertarianism is classical, and Rawls is very much in the modern vein. So Nozick's trying to uphold an old tradition of liberalism whilst adding, obviously, his own flair to it. His reaffirmation of distributive justice and fairness implicitly counters those libertarian critiques, reinforcing his commitment to an egalitarian liberal order. So what did he say in the Political Liberalism, a quintessential text for everything that we've covered in these 6 sessions of the Reading Club? Rawls' Political Liberalism in 1993 represents a major development in his thought, shifting focus from justice as a moral ideal to justice as a basis for political stability in pluralistic societies. He responds to critiques of the theory of justice again by emphasising that liberal democracy must not rest on any single comprehensive doctrine, whether religious, philosophical or ideological, but instead on a political conception of justice that people with diverse worldviews can endorse. Central to this idea of an overlapping consensus where citizens, despite deep moral and religious differences, can agree on core political principles. Rawls also introduces the idea of public reason, arguing that political debate should be framed in terms accessible to all reasonable citizens. While political liberalism again doesn't engage Robert Nozick, its emphasis on fairness and stability reinforces Rawls' rejection of libertarian, what they call minimalism, instead advocating a just democratic framework that respects pluralism while maintaining social cooperation. Just check that no one else has got any other messages to join. In chapter 4 of Theory of Justice, what we set for today, titled Equal Liberty, it's where John Rawls articulates the foundational role of basic liberties in his theory of justice. He argues that each person should have an equal right to a system of liberties that is compatible with the same right for others. These include political freedoms, such as voting and running for office, freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience, and personal freedoms like freedom of thought, and the right to hold personal property. Rawls asserts that these liberties are lexically prior to considerations of social and economic advantage. Now, lexical priorities is something that comes up quite a lot to do with sort of what we were talking about, the original position and the veil of ignorance, the things that most people know. And then he comes up with this term, lexically prior. So the first thing is to make sure that people have rights before you then go to the kind of economic redistribution of wealth. You need to make sure that you understand how individuals have equal rights in the world, the things we've discussed during talking about social contract theory. So trying to discover those are the most important. They're pivotal. So they're lexically prior to the considerations of economic advantage, meaning they cannot be sacrificed for greater economic efficiency or wealth distribution. So there's no way you can go, because, you know, at the time, criticisms of someone like him, even though he's a centrist and liberal, criticisms, particularly in your home nation, would be, oh, this is a socialist Soviet kind of imitator. But he wanted to condemn Soviet command and control economies in the same way that he wanted to condemn the failures of the West. So he wants to put these liberties first. He doesn't want to be regarded as a socialist, although later in his life he does call himself a liberal socialist. So we can get into that. He critiques utilitarianism for allowing individual rights to be compromised for the sake of overall social welfare. Instead, Rawls insists that a just society must protect these liberties as inviolable, forming the foundation for democratic legitimacy and social cooperation. Today, we'll be discussing the Rawlsian principle, his argument for equal liberty, its justification, and its implications for contemporary liberal democracies. And I have a few questions there to start us off. And yeah, with that, if Michelle, you have a question, or Dara, you have a question. But otherwise, Jack, I'm sure, the font of wisdom, Michelle.
Oh, hardly.
Yeah, I'll move the equipment over here. Go ahead, Jack, I can hear while I do it.
Can you remind me what the name for his, he had like 2 or 3 principles of justice depending on how you count them. So he says that, access to the same kinds of rights.
Yeah.
So there has to be a uniformity of rights. That's the first principle of justice. The second principle of justice, it articulates 2 conditions where inequality is tolerable.
Yeah.
The first is that when it's attached to sort of meritocracy,
yeah,
I guess.
Difference principle.
Yeah. No, because I think that's the name I'm looking for.
Yeah,
the difference principle.
Yeah.
That's the second one.
Mm-hmm.
The difference principle is that that sort of an inequality will be justified if the fruits of the successful were basically mandated to be in the service of the least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know Rawls so well, so I wanted to know what that looks like practically for Rawls, because earlier on, I think at the beginning of your introduction, I think you said Rawls wasn't someone who was interested in distributive justice, or who didn't advocate for it more precisely. But then this second condition of the second principle, this I've forgotten what you called it a minute ago. What's the name?
The difference.
The difference. Yeah.
That
strikes me as something that would serve as the foundation for a distributive project. And when I was reading the Sandel, which we'll come to later, the question was in my mind. I kept going back and forth. I couldn't make up my mind as to whether Rawls was an advocate of distributive or justice or not. Sandel identified at least one place where he seems to be.
I mean, he certainly is. This does come back to that horrible term, lexical priority.
Yeah.
That the economic redistribution has to come after the establishment of the natural rights of the
But
individual.
in principle, for Rawls, it can come after. And
Oh, definitely.
It should come after.
Certainly, yeah,
Right.
yeah. And he gets more intense on this throughout his work. So this is obviously his first major work, and he gets more and more in favour of redistribution as he goes on. As I suppose, because he's seen the Soviet Union collapse, maybe he feels like he can kind of talk a little bit more freely from a kind of slightly more left of centre persuasion. But certainly by the political liberalism and by the 90s, Rawls is very much in favour of redistribution. But I mean, the principle ultimately is rooted around a certain element of redistributive justice. Because obviously the original position has to be. Have you heard of these terms before, Michelle, or would you like me to explain?
Not many of them. Yeah, yeah.
So the original position is essentially the idea that you're, say, a baby in a bubble, floating around the earth, looking down on the earth, and you have no idea where geographically, what quality economically, gender, race, situationally, what you're going to be born into. And the idea is that from the original position, you're looking at the earth through what he terms a veil of ignorance. So you don't know what you've been born into. But you also have to remember that this is a collective thought. I mean, it all gets a bit too meta for me in some ways, but it's sort of a collective thought of if we were all babies in a bubble floating around the world thinking, well, I have no idea what situation I'm going to be born into. So therefore, I have an obligation to make the world at least good enough so that regardless of which original position I end up being born into, I could achieve a reasonable way in life. So you have to envisage building a world which, you're looking through the veil of ignorance into the world and going, I don't know where I will be born, so I need to at least redistribute to the level where everyone has an equality of opportunity. And ultimately, he is at least sort of tentatively pointing in the direction of equality of outcome, because there is an element of him which is saying, for example, one thing he really takes to task is inheritance. So he despises the idea that people will inherit wealth to pass on to the next generation, because he thinks that just creates a cyclical system of inequality. And for him, the fun, which Jack and I always like, even if we don't necessarily agree with Tinker, we do like someone who's very sort of forthright about this. And his argument is, if you're creating a system of inequality, then that flies in the face of ever saying that you're a liberal democracy, because if you have a self-perpetuating system of wealth that just keeps getting passed down, there's no room for meritocracy. Meritocracy is a lie if you're just saying, well, everyone inherits wealth. So you wouldn't have that. You'd have an original position where you go, right, everyone's born into the world at least fairly equal, still the difference principle, as Jack and I were just talking about. And then behind this veil of ignorance, you decide on a world where you can create at least a fair, a level playing field for when you have the sort of start of your life. But to answer Jack's question, he certainly does believe in redistribution, Jack. Whether he goes the whole hog in terms of distributive justice, he sort of stops short because of the difference principle of kind of being a fully convicted socialist. He does believe there should be difference between people. He thinks that that's actually fundamental to a functioning society.
That's very interesting. I thought of also the liberal theory behind free market. So the inequalities sort of disappear because you can trade.
Yes, yeah.
And exchange and
Yeah.
social mobility and so forth.
Definitely.
Why does inheritance perpetuate a systematic inequality? Why can it not be in the service of the least, in the way that
because
the kind of business monopolies that
well, he says it quite
true in the free market wouldn't serve the least, kind of the amount of money they have.
He says it quite explicitly, and you've got to remember as well, this is in the context of the Vietnam War, this is in the context of a man who went to, is it Stanford? I can't remember, it's either Harvard or Stanford. I'm having brain fog now. Yeah.
I think
I think it might be Stanford.
Yeah.
and he did an accelerated degree because it was in the middle of, sorry, not the Vietnam War, the Second World War. And he does an accelerated degree to get out. But obviously, by the time he's writing this, he's seen the Vietnam War. So he's got, so I'm jumbling up my stories here. I'm going to go with the first story. He comes out from his accelerated degree and he goes into the army. You'll like this, Dara. He goes into the army, obviously, because it was conscription in the Second World War. But he doesn't, unlike most university students, ask for a commission.
Yeah.
He says, no, I will not request a commission. I will go in with the regular soldiers because there's no right for me, just because I'm a graduate, to take a commission. Fast forward to the Vietnam War, he's seeing the political chaos in the States, of what he sees as kind of political power, which is dominated by people who have the wealth. And that wealth, yes, maybe they've made for themselves, but in a lot of circumstances, it's really not someone who's built from the ground up. That each president isn't a Jimmy Carter who's kind of, And he says, doesn't he? He says, even if formally granted political liberty loses its value whenever those who are better off are able to control the course of policy to their advantage. So he's consistently thinking that inherited wealth will lead to a political class. That is his main issue. That it will lead to a political class who will only develop policy in the interest of inherited wealth and of maintaining the power of that class of sort of legislators who will decide. And that's why he's so obsessed about this veil of ignorance, because you need to have legislation that's made from a completely reduced perspective. Now, whether or not that kind of reductive attempt is actually possible is one of the main flaws, I think, in Rawls' argument. But we can get into that. But yeah, that's what I'd say in terms of the inherited wealth. It's very much his issue with the political class.
You said that it's the political class, right? But if you think about, obviously, you talk about his example of him not wanting to go and get a commission in the army. That's obviously not the political class. And he'd be applying sort of the same principles to, like, I don't know, barristers or lawyers or doctors. So it wouldn't just be the political class, but it would be the ruling class, perhaps, maybe.
Yeah. And I suppose he's using that situation as a vehicle of a broader argument, which is like there shouldn't just be an expectation that one group of people are different to the other. Conscription is a universal thing. Everyone's got an obligation. Why would he be any different just because he's studied law and economics at Stanford? Like, why would that suddenly make him a much greater individual to serve? Rather than, obviously, we know that education and these things are important, and he loves meritocracy. That's part of the reason why he wants to do away with this kind of elitist political class. But he also sees people who are getting into university because of their background and then getting commissions. And he's saying, well, that's not quite right. They're not necessarily the most talented people, really. They're getting into university and getting out of being conscripted as a regular GI because of their wealth. I think is sort of the kind of underlying factor in that. But yeah, which obviously the current president has some issues with as well. And but yeah.
He says he's for meritocracy.
Yeah.
We're not quite seeing how he got there yet, but
Exactly.
Yeah.
But obviously the political classes of most countries do ultimately reside in a certain level of wealth. So he's got a real problem with the legislators.
But how would you then say that we'll get over that? How would you change that?
Well, his idea is that you don't. He basically would believe in almost a full taxation on inheritance. Like, that would be his opinion.
Right.
But he thinks it's just fundamentally wrong. That there's some people, again, it's situationist because he's a utilitarian, but he's situationist as well. So he's combining these two philosophies. So as much as he would like that, he would obviously want to look at sort of how much wealth someone had and whether that wealth could benefit them. Again, and I'm sure Jack will very much delve into this, but it's a bit like trying to discuss Bentham. It's like, well, how do you actually work out the hedonic calculus? How do you work out whether it's going to be the maximum pleasure for the maximum number? For him, it's like, yeah, how do you actually work out where wealth is benefiting someone fairly? Or, it's complicated, but ideally, that would be the situation that you would withdraw the inheritance completely, basically. But yeah, sorry, Jack. And a prime example, just while Jack's thinking, is obviously the case of Citizens UK in the US with the super PACs. Before the Citizens UK case, at least there was the opportunity, a bit like with, say, Bernie Sanders' campaign, of kind of like doing individual donations and things like that. A perfect case of what Rawls would hate is the idea of the super PACs, where a certain cabal of people push money into political campaigns, and thereby, even if the candidate isn't inherited wealth, isn't an inherited wealth and could be a self-made man or woman, ultimately the super PACs, who are the inherited wealth, are deciding who the candidates could be. So that would be a prime example today where Rawls's ideas would really apply, and he would think that society has gone downhill since his time. Yeah, Jack, have you?
I didn't have an immediate response to that. I am interested, however, in the lexical priority thing. Why does he separate sort of economic, social policy from, or something secondary to, more fundamental questions of right and liberty, justice?
Well, he does talk about this again in the chapter where he says each person possesses an inviolability founded on justice that even the welfare of society as a whole cannot override. So he's got this fundamental issue with utilitarianism, just as he has it with like free market capitalism, which is that there is a worry that like if you accept, say, a basic utilitarian perspective, you maybe try and work out, first of all, the pleasure. How much pleasure is someone getting? We need to aim for pleasure, right? He then thinks, well, on an individual basis, if you're doing that, trying to work out the individual pleasure, well, what if one person, if we take the example of one person, what if one person has loads of pleasure and one person has a medium amount of pain? Well, the utilitarian argument would be you need to accept that person's moderate pain, and then try and support the person's maximalisation of pleasure on the other part. For him, that's flawed, because if you extrapolate that to society, that could mean, well, we'll just make it really, really hard for a subsection of society. We can see Mill here. We can see what we discussed about the 99 versus the 1 in society.
The power itself is illegitimate.
Exactly, and he would agree, because he's not, right and left both kind of bandy around terms about Rawls, and I mean he's not a left-wing thinker. He is a centrist in many ways, because he's combining both traditions of the left and the right. But he would see that as the worst sort of outcome, to see a minority subjugated for the pleasure of others. So he really feels he's in a Lockean tradition in that sense. He really believes that the rights are the priority. You need to establish those before anything else. So that's why that's fully prioritized above any economic considerations. Totally. Was there anything else there, Jack, that you wanted to expand on? I can only hear Samuel, but not Jack and the others. Oh, the fancy mic could be moved to the table if it was not already. That would be great. I'll move the iPad as well, just in case. I don't know how the mic and iPad correlate. Sorry, Lorraine. I'm just going to move the iPad a little bit closer to them as well.
It may have just been pensive silence. You may have been expecting me to have been speaking.
What was that?
Yeah. I'll make this over here because it might get a little bit more there.
Yeah,
a little bit over there.
Yeah, that could be all right.
Use your big voice.
Turn it around in your direction, Dara, just in case there's messages.
I'm sure that'll be fine. So I was reading the Stanford Encyclopedia and was trying to get an overview, and they described Rawls' projects as trying to sort of overcome this tension between freedom and justice. Yeah, I guess so. Oh no, the tension between freedom and equality.
Yes.
Right, that was it. And
The perennial issue
yeah,
of
and,
political
that's
philosophy.
right. That the idea of justice as fairness was what mediated between these, and that's central to the text, theory of justice. I wondered if you could clarify what precisely he means by fairness, whether you think it's a successful mediator of those two, of sort of the demand for freedom to pursue our obligation, but also this fear for inequalities that emerge.
I mean, it's strange, isn't it? Because I don't know whether this is also something in the US, Michelle, that is done more often, but the sort of conflation of justice and fairness in his work, I think, maybe is a way, like, in the US, linguistically, would you use those terms almost interchangeably? Would you say that's fair or that's just?
Yeah, you never hear about justice. Like, we don't care about justice.
Fine, okay. Because I'd say, at least in the UK, justice comes with a very legalistic framework.
Yeah, it's closer to Hayek.
Yeah, and I feel that he sort of uses them interchangeably. Like, if you had a kid come back from school and they said, I think I was treated unfairly at school today, that'd be fine. If you had a kid come back from school and said, I was treated unjustly today, is that person's father a lawyer, or what's going on here? So, I mean, I think he bandies them around quite interchangeably. But I mean, the equality question, I would say, and again, he addresses this in the chapter where he says the basic liberties must be the same for all, and their worth must be guaranteed, regardless of one's social or economic position. So fundamentally, these are things that need to be just or need to be fair between everyone before you start to build up that economic redistribution that we've been discussing. And again, I think the equality needs to be there because, as I've been saying, he's not like when we discussed the French existentialists. He's not sort of like some sort of fanboy of the Soviet regime. He's very much a believer in democracy and how democracy can really fulfill the dream that he's setting out in this text. And he says the liberties of the equal citizens are taken as settled. The rights secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining or to the calculus of social interests. So I think there, what he's addressing is exactly what you're asking, Jack, which is that he wants equality. He wants equality of opportunity, and we can debate how far he wants equality of outcome, because it obviously is pointing in that direction much more than any just thinker that we've discussed in this series. But he doesn't want there to be projects which start to say, oh, yes, of course, rights are important, but ultimately we need to think about the whole, a much more left-wing project in the direction of Soviet totalitarianism. He wants, and to use that term calculus, he's really directly criticising someone like Bentham and saying, I don't want there to be a calculus of sort of bargaining rights with equality. I want rights first, and then work out how we do equality.
Right.
Michelle, Dar, any questions in terms of like any other sort of elements of this?
No, I guess just how do you get to that even ground?
Yeah.
Which is obviously, I mean, we're definitely trying to figure that out in the States, and I feel it's very apt with what's happening back home with like Trump dismantling DEI and that being, on the table. It makes sense that it doesn't work within a meritocracy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I
agree.
How do you get there?
And again, I think the US is the best example, because a prime example that comes up a lot if you read anything about Rawls applied to modern politics, particularly from the 2000s. Obviously, the most catastrophic event in the early 2000s, 9/11, Rawls's ideas are immediately brought in because, or not immediately, but sort of in the aftermath of the kind of like revelations of the tortures in Guantanamo Bay, for example. And how do you put social welfare, this kind of lexically inferior, but still very high up on Rawls's agenda or a liberal democracy's agenda? How do you weigh up social welfare? You know, trying to make sure that 9/11 never happens again. So, you know, getting information out of terrorists, etc., with these natural rights that Rawls is saying are the priority above anything else. You know, the right of that terrorist or whatever it needs to be sacrosanct, and we're trying to get things out of them by basically alienating their rights, saying you don't have any rights, and we're going to torture you to get information. But again, that's for social welfare. But for Rawls, that would be wrong because you missed the first priority, lexical priority. You need the liberty of rights first before you start to try and address any social issues. You need to remember the innate rights of every human being. So very Lockean, but coming down the chain starts to become a little bit more Rousseau. It starts to become a little bit more contemporary liberal in terms of the social distribution. So yeah, so I think that's sort of how I would tackle that. And did I have any other particular points? I've printed out papers for today. I feel very formal. I mean, I could quickly. Hang on, what is the time? Right, I've probably got about 5 minutes until I should let, because we're going to be covering this obviously anyway. So I'll let you pass over, and then we'll go into Sandel. But quickly before we do, and to set the frame for I think where Sandel's coming from, let me just touch on Nozick. So in Anarchy, State and Utopia, Nozick sort of engages in this discursive debate about Rawls's theory being seen as sort of a responsible utilitarianism, justifying actions based on the greatest good for the greatest number, but creating a theory of justice that would safeguard the individual rights that we've been talking about. Nozick critiques utilitarianism just like Rawls is. So, you know, both of them are critical of utilitarianism in its sort of purest form, but particularly because it can justify the violation of individual rights in the pursuit of social welfare. So exactly the tension we've just raised. Nozick's like saying, Rawls, you haven't answered this. You've used this term lexical priority, but ultimately in the day-to-day, you can't say, oh, well, I'm not sure whether I want to help that person because it might infringe my rights, or I'm not sure whether, I want to, torture someone. You can't just say lexical priority and then say everything's fine. It's like this kind of weird fallback that Rawls has added between two perennial issues in political philosophy and just say, well, just consider it as a lexical priority. It's like, well, that doesn't really help legislators. So Nozick is criticising Rawls for that and rejects any version of justice that involves redistributing wealth. So Nozick basically goes back to this classical liberal position and says, Rawls, you haven't answered the question at all. Basically, all we can do is ensure that people have rights. And beyond that, the state really isn't very effective at doing anything to redistribute. At the same time, Nozick is a proponent of libertarianism, as I was sort of saying at the start, which emphasises the individual freedoms of Locke and at this time there's this obsession with the phrase minimalism, state minimalism, or I don't know what it would be today, but it's very Trumpian, sort of state withdrawing from intervention. Obviously, Rawls is often associated with the social contract theories that we've explored over the last few sessions, which argue that individuals need to come together to form a society based on principles of fairness and equality, etc. But Nozick critiques Rawls, and essentially one thing I missed in my introduction is that essentially you've got to remember that Rawls's theories, as much as after the war you have the Attlee government, you have FDR in the States really doing these big social welfare projects, the idea of social contract theory, maybe up until Mill. But social contract theory has been out of fashion by Rawls' time. It's been out of fashion for 7 decades. I mean, no one's talking about social contract theory. The existentialists are talking about individualism. There's no place for social contract theory in individualist society, and they're on the left. And then on the right, you've got massive individualist political philosophy theories. Obviously, anything from libertarianism to kind of anarcho-capitalism to kind of laissez-faire economics. I mean, the idea of a social contract, as much as you have the left-wing projects after the war, they're much more in this kind of communitarian, very much political agenda, rather than there being a sense of kind of like the social contract. So Rawls is drawing on a very old tradition, which leaves him open to a lot of criticism by 3 generations of people who have rejected social contract theory. So it's very difficult for him to be a defender of it. You also have a sort of tension between Robert Nozick and Rawls on a sort of Hegelian versus a Marxist view of the state. Or Hegelian and a Marxist view on the state, sorry. Because Hegelian and Marxist views focus on the ways in which the state serves the interests of particular classes, often viewing the state as an instrument of economic domination. And Rawls, although he's not a Marxist, aligns more with that idea, that the state has an active role in addressing inequality, as you were saying earlier, Jack, in terms of how does that redistributive element work. Nozick draws from the classical liberal perspective, which is primarily a protector of individual rights, and very much arguing against the idea that the state should be involved in peripheral matters, and particularly not on central matters like the economy. So this is a real clash of ideas. And on individual rights, Nozick in his Anarchy, State, Utopia says individuals have rights and there are things no personal group may do to them without violating their rights. The minimal state is the most extensive state that can be justified, and any more extensive state violates people's rights. A distribution is just if it arises from another just distribution by legitimate means. So essentially everything, a bit like Jack was saying about the free market, everything, if you want there to be a functioning state, it has to be really a free market. You can't have anything beyond the state. On the theory of justice as a historical process, Nozick says a theory of justice then is a historical theory, one that looks to the process by which holdings are acquired and transferred. And then criticising Rawls, the difference principle violates people's rights by interfering with their legitimate claims to the products of their labour and their choices. So he says, well, yeah, Rawls leaves a bit of space for a bit of difference, but ultimately he still wants to redistribute, so you're just taking away from people who've worked hard, who have, succeeded, that sort of thing. So very, very critical. And I think with that lays a perfect segue for Jack to present Sandel and his criticisms. Yeah. Do you want Jack to the iPad's there? So
I will, yes. Yeah. I'll come around. Do you want to sit here, Sam?
Yeah, I don't mind.
You can stay if you want. I'm just going to take this seat. I thought next to the microphone, I have my bit.
Any comments in the chat?
No, it's just yeah.
Which is good because it means they can hear us.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's a good segue because the paper of a chapter from Sandel's book that we said deals precisely with this question of what to make of ownership, what to make of the right to property, and then the right to anything in general, the right to possession of anything in general. Because although Rawls begins with this idea that property rights, as one example of certain rights, are electrically prior to socio-economic conditions, the idea of redistribution sort of goes up against that. And it's, if you dig a bit deeper, it turns out that Rawls doesn't really believe that anyone has an intrinsic right to property, but more that people have a right to property based on certain criteria that they meet in the socio-economic world. So paradoxically, it ends up coming last. It's the state that assigns to you what property you own and what doesn't. So it's, the authority comes first, not his critique of inheritance, right? So I come into this world a blank slate,
Yeah.
politically speaking, echoing things that we've talked about before, kind of like John Locke, but I don't think would be a redistributionist.
No.
Or maybe actually, because he does qualify that he thinks that there is a common sense excess to property and that ought to be curbed, which is an interesting side point. Yes, I would just enjoy the segue a bit. Okay. I also just wanted to. The reason I was mentioning that is because although we've just heard Nozick's criticism of the redistribution, one of the core things that Sandel's chapter deals with is saying that actually, Nozick, your argument doesn't work because it's founded on the same premise that enables Rawls to say that distribution is a social good, namely the premise that the subject is this blank slate. So the core of Sandel's argument against Rawls and against Nozick is we've got to return to a concept of the situated subject. That's the means of the segue. So Michael Sandel, he's still alive. He's the first and only thinker we're dealing with who's still alive. I'm very pleased to say. He was born in 1952. He's an American political philosopher and popular author on such subjects as liberty, justice, the common good, meritocracy, the free market, the ethics of such things, globalization and localization, the loss of community, the decline of community, and how we might recover it. Those are the things he's very interested in. The reason for this is that part of the reason for this is that he studied in Oxford under a guy called Charles Taylor, who is a very significant philosopher. I think he's also still alive. A very significant philosopher of political theory and of ethics, who is one of the earliest figures in a tradition, a modern tradition that we call communitarianism, not communism. Communitarianism was very interested in exposing certain assumptions in political thought, particularly in libertarianism and liberalism, to do with radical individualism, and putting the community second, putting virtue ethics second, putting all kinds of values second, and trying to strive for this value neutral location. And the communitarians were saying that value neutral place doesn't exist. Yeah. You've got to start with the community, with the tradition, with the inheritance, the intellectual inheritance primarily, but also the geographical and the institutional inheritance also. You don't get to abstract, as Rawls does, from that condition. As Hayek also agrees on this, although he's not a communitarian and he still is an individualist at heart. But Hayek does believe that reason and freedom are constituted by tradition, do not themselves make traditions out of nothing, do not make institutions out of nothing. So we saw that on Tuesday. So the other important writer of communitarianism is a guy called Alasdair MacIntyre. He's famous for a book called After Virtue. I think it came out in the 70s. And in After Virtue, he basically says, look, our discourse on ethics is in shambles, and here's why. There's these internal disagreements. There is no value neutral point. And the dominant discourse on ethics is what he calls a motivist. It's well, I think this is right because I say so. It's sort of the justification for ethics is in the individual alone. And so he challenges that, and he puts forward a way of advancing on our ethics without claiming to leave our traditions and leaving our worldviews and leaving our cultures and communities. Charles Taylor did the same thing, and the basic concept, and you see this in Sandel, which is why I'm going on about it in some detail. The basic idea is that we've got to stop trying to think about ethics from a priori principles, like arguments from a natural, from a state of nature, or from an abstract state of affairs prior to all context. that kind of argument, as powerful as it has been in the philosophical tradition, is too ambitious with all the skepticism we have today. So let's just settle for a kind of comparative argument where we have a discourse about ethics and we say, well, my ethical worldview seems to account for more of the problems that we have in ethics than yours does, and maybe that makes it a better worldview. I haven't left my worldview. I haven't claimed to get a neutral point, but by a relative comparison, we do make advances. So the communitarians were very big on this. It's a style of argument that dominates in the tradition of scientific thinking. So how do scientists advance their theory? They don't do a priori arguments. They say, well, my scientific theory accounts for this anomaly and everything else yours does. Yours doesn't account for this anomaly. Therefore, let's change the story we're telling. Okay, so that's a bit about the communitarians. So that's what Sandel inherits. So clearly of influence to Sandel, who first published Liberalism and the Limits of Justice in 1982, specifically targeting Rawls' theories of justice and the radical individualism that Rawls presents as a value neutral to the reasons I've described. The work came after his employment at Harvard, where he taught classes on justice for over 2 decades. And I was reading a Wikipedia article on this, and these classes were so popular. He had, I think he would teach it in 2005 or something, like 1,500 students through the year on this course. And it was the first program that Harvard commissioned to be televised. He turned it into a series of videos and televised it, and the BBC did something similar, and LSE did something similar also. It was a very, very popular course. Subsequently published very popular work, which I guess is why I think you've described as a literary critic.
Yes,
in your introduction.
yeah.
He's a popular author. You go down to Waterstones up the road and you'll find Michael Sandel. You won't find John Rawls in a like on the front page. You'll find him in the philosophy section tucked away, but you'll find Michael Sandel on the table. Democracy Discontent was in 1996. Incidentally, during a time that we associate with the peak of optimism about liberalism. And I guess Francis Fukuyama's famous book must have come out around that time as well. The Berlin Wall has fallen. We seem to have our economy sorted out. This is just before 9/11, where things were clearly shown to be not right. And he publishes this book in 1996, basically saying, look, there are all these anxieties and tensions about democracy. People do not necessarily feel that their voices are represented in the government. That came as early as 1996. I was very surprised to learn that. Public Philosophy, 2005, was more of a communitarian thing. What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, where he talks about how the free market sort of makes us sacrifice a lot of our morals. And he talks about how, on a free market worldview, you can exchange body organs and traffic people. Because it's just, the only value that the free market's interested in, technically speaking, is economic value. So he's naturally criticizing that, drawing our attention to it with some urgency. And most recently, The Tyranny of Merit, where he criticizes meritocracy for, I think, similar reasons as sort of his criticism against the free market. The meritocracy thing, for Sandel, I suppose, abstracts a little bit from socioeconomic circumstances. I think that's the argument he put forward. I haven't read that book. Okay. The chapter that I mentioned comes from Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. There, Sandel argued that the veil of neutrality that Rawls depended on for the selection of the basic criteria of justice was a fantasy. So, if we recall, the veil of neutrality is Rawls' neutral starting point. The baby in space that Sam so creatively came up with that enables us to use common reason that's available to everybody to determine the basic starting point for questions of freedom and questions of what rights we have. Because Sandel is a communitarian, he wouldn't. I should mention he wouldn't be so happy with the term. I think he sees himself as a little bit different. In what precise respects, I'm not sure, but for our purposes, it doesn't matter. Because Sandel committed to this idea that human beings are situated and that you can't abstract their values from their identity and their inheritance from their identity. This idea of the value neutral space is absurd. There's no way of moving from that place that Rawls articulates as the original position to community, and just to life as we experience it. The kind of abstract question that Rawls uses to frame justice don't seem to match on to our lived experience of questions of justice and right, according to Sandel. So the technical way of putting it is Sandel is committed to the idea that people's moral values are constitutive of their identity and not accidental to it. So consequently, it has no real relation to lived experience. Not simply for the reason that it's like ideal in a matter of degree from the practical reality. Rawls is happy to say that the original position is a theoretical construct, but it's just a few tweaks, and then you get to the lived reality. Sandel is saying, there's absolutely no relation here. There's no possible neutral point between different conceptions of justice, between different worldviews. He draws from this that Rawls' idea of the citizen is morally incompetent, because he has no experience of what it's like to work out moral differences within inherited traditions and inherited worldviews. Sandel argued that liberalism broadly has insufficiently accounted for the historical and social situations of individuals and has consequently tended to reduce public goods to private interests, and ultimately to detach the common good from the problem of providing for liberty and justice. So we sort of saw that Rawls treats the issue, I would argue, treats the issue of common good as distinct. I think he said explicitly in, I can't remember if it was the Stanford article I read or in the chapter you set, Sam, that we deal with the rights and then secondarily we deal with what the common good is.
Yep.
For Sandel, those are inseparable. There must be a return to moral and civic formation in community and in the universities as the cornerstone of society, very Rousseauian. This project must in turn be shown to be entirely compatible with a positive conception of freedom, because Sandel's criticism is that the libertarians are dishonest about their starting point. It's not value neutral, so first be honest about that, or be aware of it. Second, he's going to be honest about what his vision of the common good is, and everyone else should be honest about that vision. And we're going to use the institutions at our disposal to have a serious conversation about that, and through comparative argument, we're going to grow. But we're not going to abandon our communal ties and our ethics for that purpose. And so this is a positive conception of freedom because everyone's operating on the premise that we are trying to be free for a particular thing. It isn't just free to self-determine. Everyone's free to self-determine in an abstract way. Even the state itself has some idea of what we're striving for. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a state because there'd be nothing binding us. Too many theorists are too shy to talk about this, including Hayek. Sandel follows, as I mentioned, Sandel follows Taylor in arguing that an honest discourse about ethical differences will overcome pluralism by drawing attention to those conceptions of justice that solve more problems than the alternatives. The comparative style of argument. What is important is not so much the total amelioration of differences as being able to propose genuine alternatives. Liberalism in Sandel's view tended towards a relative hegemony or narrow-mindedness about policy. I had some questions. I sort of rushed to write them down this afternoon. So maybe use them as a last resort. I don't know if they're helpful, but perhaps there are questions.
Do you think Sandel actually solves that issue in terms of the perennial issue that we have been discussing, which is not to be too kind of blunt, but are they not talking past each other to some point? Like Rawls isn't only Sandel's criticism is one of he's homogenizing. Well, yes, he is, but Rawls is addressing two fundamental questions of political philosophy, which are how do you try and synthesize economic justice with a sort of individual liberty. Now, how far is Sandel actually solving that question rather than just criticizing one half of the argument? Rawls is coming at this from a perspective of, I want to try and bridge the gap between these two things. Is Sandel just saying you can't do that? You have to just take into perspective situation, individual circumstance, and it's impossible? Or is there a way that Sandel could see to bridge that divide?
To bridge the divide between
liberty and economic justice.
And
obviously economic justice is a vague term because Rawls isn't saying like everyone should have the same amount of money.
I guess my impression, my limited impression of what I've read is that you're going to solve the economic inequalities not through this, like through abstracting from the economic inequality. And I guess the most important thing for Sandel is to show, at least in this text and in this work, is to show that while Rawls sets out to bridge these, I guess the ontology gets in the way of that. The ontology of the human person gets in the way of that. There is a contradiction in Rawls, which he doesn't seem to be so aware of. You know, there's the property rights and then the freedoms initially, and then suddenly there's the redistributive policy, and the hidden assumption that makes that work is this idea of an abstract person to whom no property, no inheritance could ever have been said to have been owed to by natural right. And so I guess Sandel would say that almost brushes aside the real problem, because it discounts what might be described as legitimate claims to property for the sake of solving an abstract problem of inequalities, which sometimes seem to serve the lower classes, sometimes don't. I'm not sure if property is really, for instance, so distinct
and
from some of the other things that he thinks do serve the lower classes.
And I suppose bouncing off of that, would you not say that one fundamental issue of Sandel's critique is that Rawls explicitly says he's not laying out a moralistic kind of like day-to-day ethical way of living. He's not a utilitarian. He's not trying to lay out how you should live your life day to day. He's explicitly trying to lay out a political framework. And just before the tirade, is Sandel not coming at him as if he's like an ethical philosopher and coming at him like, oh, you abstract it? And whereas what Rawls is really trying to do is say, no, what I'm trying to do is abstract simply for political purposes. I'm not trying to abstract for ethical purposes. I'm not saying that there's not individuals. I've actually laid out that individuals are the most important thing above everything. And I'm being criticised more as a philosopher, as an ethicist, rather than as a political thinker. Do you see what I mean?
I understand your point. I think Sandel is saying that is precisely the problem with Rawls. So he's not trying to. He's not trying. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's not trying to say that Rawls is a bad philosopher of ethics. He's saying that he completely discounted like genuine ethics.
Yeah.
You know, some point like that, we would actually ask these questions to ourselves. He's similar to Hayek. I would say the same thing about Hayek. Hayek speaks of virtue and of morality as though it's just mere pragmatics and competence and so forth. And Rawls is the same. It's sort of political utility, social utility. it has nothing with it. That's one aspect of ethics.
Yeah.
One aspect of justice. So I guess Sandel's challenge to Rawls and to other thinkers is to enrich their concept of the human person, thereby enriching the concept of justice, to bring back the more ethical dimension, to put back in the centre the human being who has, by virtue of his birth and his situation, social bonds, linguistic bonds, cultural bonds.
Now,
which can't be discounted.
To be the political historian here, what I would like to add in is that we live in a unique moment, I'd say, in history now, which obviously Sandel is more, as he's alive, more primarily placed to address, which is that the issue that Rawls was trying to address, right, was this tension between liberty, the free market US, and economic justice, Soviet totalitarianism. And there's always been this idea that if you move in one direction, the other will be limited, right? Okay, so if you move towards more focus on freedom, individual rights, you're going to move away from economic justice. If you move towards economic justice, you're going to infringe on people's expression and people's way of life. We live in a time now where there is an erosion of both simultaneously. We can see this, say, Bolsonaro, and the rise of authoritarianism in countries where you're voting in people who are directly infringing on rights in the idea of sort of social welfare, but at the same time, social welfare is decreasing in these authoritarian nations. Now, I don't know how Sandel would respond. I'm not sure how Rawls would respond, but actually we live at a time where both are decreasing because of the way that people are making their political decisions. That liberties are decreasing and social welfare is decreasing. I'm not saying that's happening necessarily in the UK or the US, but we can see it in other countries. Do you think Rawls and Sandel would have any way of responding to that? Because they were addressing a fundamentally different question, that one would rise as the other would fall. If both are falling at the time we live, do Rawls and Sandel have any answer to the kind of situation that we're living in today?
Very good question. I have no idea, but I have.
Well, they're still alive. We can call them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Get on the street.
But I have a paragraph that comes right at the end of the Sandel chapter, which maybe touches on this. He says, literally the last paragraph, liberalism teaches respect for the distance of self and ends, and when this distance is lost, we are submerged in circumstances that cease to be ours. Referencing the totalitarianism.
Yeah.
But by seeking to secure this distance too completely, as Rawls does implicitly in this paragraph, liberalism undermines its own insight, the insight of maintaining the distance between self and ends. By putting the self beyond the reach of politics, it makes human agency an article of faith rather than an object of continuing attention and concern, a premise of politics rather than its precarious achievement. This misses the pathos of politics and also its most inspiring possibilities. It overlooks the danger that when politics goes badly, not only disappointment but also dislocation are likely to result. And it forgets the possibility that when politics goes well, we can know a good in common that we cannot know alone.
That's very nice.
Did that answer your
somewhat
question?
I think Dara or Michelle, do you have any questions about Sandel?
No, he sounds like he's just playing devil's advocate to Rawls. That's
sounds like it's trying to provoke reaction from him in some way.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of feeds into what I was going to say, and depending on how much more we want to do. I mean, the biggest criticism that because to be honest with you, my knowledge of Sandel was very limited before Jack enlightened me in the lead up to this. but it came from the postmodernists. It came from, this sphere of left-wing intellectuals. And you have two people that I've mentioned before, Charles Mills and Carol Pateman in the 1970s and 80s, who are writing the racial contract and the sexual contract. And their criticism, similar to Sandel about the sort of how can you individuate within Rawls's conception of this sort of abstracted idea. And their criticism is the history of social contract theory. The reason people abandoned it was that the social contract theory originated from a very Western, homogenized view of how politics operates, right? So if you withdraw to this abstracted state, yes, you can withdraw, but you're withdrawing within a certain vision of the state as it is. You're not withdrawing to the level of Rousseau. You're not saying like, oh, we're living in the forest and everyone's sort of like trying to kind of work out how to live. You're withdrawing within a certain paradigm. And Charles Mills says, it's just not possible. You're ignoring history, essentially. If you try and say everyone has an equal sort of like abstracted state, you're not taking into account slavery, you're not taking into account the subjection of black Africans within the Western world. You're not taking into account for Carol Pateman, you're not taking into account the fact that, how is politics operating at the time? In the UK, it's only been about 10 years at the time that, maybe even not that. When does it change? It's within a decade. It's probably even less than 10 years. But even in the UK, cumulative voting for a family was still the case into the 60s. So, we always think that enfranchisement came when women were given the vote. But in the 60s, you could still go and vote on behalf of you and your wife if you were married. No questions asked. So even in this kind of progressive 60s period, you can still go and vote. The state to which Rawls is suggesting we withdraw is clearly a very biased perspective of the world. It's still going to be this kind of white Western male version of how we want to build the world. And this is where it feeds into what Jack's been saying about Sandel. Because if you don't take into account history, if you don't take into account the person, the individual, the agent, their situation, their circumstance, how can you possibly even attempt to build a world that's fair or just without any contextual information at all? Now, Rawls and sort of Rawlsian apologists try to get around this because he does add an element. I don't know how far you read, Jack, but he does sort of touch on class.
Okay, I didn't get it.
He does sort of touch on class, and a lot of apologists for Rawls will say like, oh well, race and gender kind of are incorporated into his idea that there are certain class-based issues that we'll have to address if we want to redistribute and sort of work out. But it does feel like he sort of forgets that we really do have a level of differentiation in the world that even if we withdraw to try and make a better world, it's still going to be in the vision of someone's idea of a good world. And I think that's part of the issue that Sandel raises. And ironically, it's also part of the idea that very, very left-wing scholars raise as well about Rawls. And I don't know if you would have anything to add there, Jen.
You mentioned something, so apologies for me interrupting, apologies for me going a little bit off topic here. But you mentioned how, obviously, they were having a go at Rawls for having no context.
Yeah.
Do you reckon there'll be any link there between things such as colonialism and having that sort of Western influence on sort of colonial countries and it not working because you have no context of their sort of background, their culture?
Yeah.
Do you think there'll be any link there, or am I just being completely?
Oh, definitely. And this is the great return of universalism. So this is, again, a passionate topic of Jack's, but this is the first time that someone's actually taken Kant, Hayek does, but taken Kant and really pushed it into the political mainstream with what Rawls is doing about this universalism, about trying to apply it to all circumstances. So definitely, it's a massive issue because Kant faces a lot of issues when it comes to who is a person, what counts as, an active citizen within the kind of categorical imperative. There's lots of flaw. And Charles, I can't recommend it enough, particularly for what you're doing, Michelle, in terms of your PhD. Charles Mills, The Racial Contract, would be a fantastic text for you. It's not that long, and it goes through a lot of the thinkers that we've addressed and the fundamental flaws of where they start at, and therefore what's echoed through. And he finishes with Rawls, and he says as much as Rawls is admirable, he still falls down at the same place that 18th century scholars were falling down. But yeah, definitely. And I mean, within the context of the day, obviously, he's seeing the atrocities in Vietnam, and that's influencing a lot of political, ethical kind of figures. You have Joseph Fletcher and his situation ethics, coming directly out of the Vietnam War, and Joseph Fletcher, another stateside scholar, is saying that he's a full-on utilitarian, and he's saying that everything needs to be based on agape, universal love. And I think colonial conflict, I think these things are fundamental to how these scholars are framing their ideas, and I think it's unfair to criticise them fully for not being aware of kind of like racial and gender differences, because I do think that Rawls is genuinely, his core principle is to try and address those, but a little step further, and how far are those issues actually addressed outside of him being a kind of optimist? How far would the political class ever actually address those issues? How far can you actually get beyond what the political class is operating within? He doesn't really address the kind of fundamental core issues of how the state would transform to be able to do this, which, if we criticise utilitarianism, is the fundamental issue of utilitarians throughout. They don't really have an idea of how the state would actually do it. And maybe at some point we can do a series on
the thing is with utilitarianism, though,
yeah.
the way I see it is it's just an ethical sort of principle. It doesn't, apart from things like the greatest good for the greatest number, etc., there's no real sort of massive links that you can apply it to running the state.
Yeah.
Because for me, it feels as though it's sort of like a one-size-fits-all approach. Whereas, ideally on paper it works, but like in reality, it's really hard to sort of implement something like the greatest good for the greatest number. And also, that's what I think the issue is for utilitarianism.
And if you want to get very post-colonial about it, in the back of his mind, Rawls is still, what is he actually suggesting? Let's look at this in the practicalities of his day. He's still suggesting that it will be America who redistribute for everyone else. It's still very much a Western, Northern Hemisphere view of the world, that it will be the West leading to benevolently give this kind of worldview to the rest of that uncivilized world. So, he's not really moved on from 18th century scholars if you're taking it from that lens. I mean, he has, obviously. He's a compassionate man. The whole reason he's coming up with this is because he cares. But functioning-wise, practicalities-wise, has it changed much from the Age of Enlightenment? I'm not sure that it has.
Possibly not. I was interested, as you were thinking, as you were saying about this. I think we mentioned this on Tuesday. Hayek does a bit better on this question. Although both Hayek and Rawls are in their own ways applying Kantian universalizable ethics, the way they see to exercise it is quite different. I'm struggling to understand precisely why, but the consequences of the difference is that whereas Rawls is advocating a universalizable ethic sort of in a common reason, which I think is much more Kantian. For Hayek, it's what is universalizable in a negative way. So it's always about laying out the conditions where if a future situation arises, but it's always done in the background of I don't know fully the principles underlying the tradition I've inherited. That's why the legislature to try and make those explicit and revise our explications of it. There's always this ignorance in the background, whereas I don't think Rawls has that. But does that say of Hayek, even if that's sufficient?
I think Rawls really picks up on that. Is it what's their first clause of the categorical imperative? Is it the mere means, or is it the universalizable in all circumstances? It's either the first or the second clause.
From memory, it's the second one you said. It's that it has to be universalizable.
Because
I think the using people
is the first.
And then never the means comes later.
Well, whether it's the second or the first, this will be a nice point maybe to round up, but Rawls says, utilitarianism does not take seriously the distinction between persons. It permits treating individuals as means to the greater welfare, rather than as ends in themselves. So very much drawing on that, on that tradition. And that's clearly where he's getting that element. Now, as you say, whether higher court Rawls deals with it better, I suppose.
But then I guess Sandel trumps them all.
Yeah. Sandel trumps them all. A lovely way to end our Liberty series, 6 sessions on liberty. Thank you, Michelle, for being here in person. Thank you to everyone online for joining us. I don't know, we haven't had any questions or comments. Marvellous. Well, we'd just like to say thank you for joining us for these 6 sessions. And over the next couple of weeks, Jack and I will be trying to comprise the next 6 sessions.
Yes, on heritage.
Heritage and tradition. So we're very excited to delve into that. But in the meantime, we wish you a nice couple of weeks. And thank you very much for joining us. But well done, Jack, for that section. So, and well done to everyone. Marvellous. Right.
How do you turn off switch up?
Right.
I don't know what you use it.
Thank you, everyone online. Goodbye.